Dungeons and Dragons is an amazing game. It's my favorite game. And Wizards of the Coast produced that game. They published the game. And they're good at a lot of things, but the rules and the way that they're written oftentimes can leave dungeon masters like me frustrated by their ambiguity, their vagueness, and oftentimes can even put players and dungeon masters at odds because of their lack of clarity. If a player comes to a table and has an idea of how an ability or a spell works and they're intending to use it in that way, and the dungeon master has a different idea of how that spell or that ability works, it creates conflict that needs to be resolved. Now, Jeremy Crawford is like the boss of the rules of Dungeons and Dragons, and he has over time created errata and sage advice to help resolve some of these questions that keep coming up about the rules of Dungeons and Dragons. I personally haven't gone through any of them until recently, so I want to go through the newest version of Sage Advice that was recently released and updated with you guys. I don't want to go through all of it, but I want to hit on points that I think probably are commonly misused at the table, ones that I've messed up on, and the ones that I just think are interesting. So I'm going to split it up into a couple videos. I think today we'll just go through the racial traits and the class features. And then at the end, I will tack on maybe one or two things that I think were missed that would have been really nice to see. Here on racial traits, the first question is, does the trance trait allow an elf to finish a long rest in 4 hours? This is a good question to ask. I've been a part of many parties. We almost always have an elf, and I want to explain this a little bit more as we continue with the answer. The answer is, if an elf meditates during a long rest, the elf finishes the rest after only 4 hours. A meditating elf otherwise follows all the rules for a long rest. Only the duration has changed. So during a long rest, you don't have to sleep the entire time, but it is assumed that you will be sleeping for a good amount of that time. You can relax, eat food, write in a journal, whatever you want. But I would say, oftentimes, elves in a party will say things like, well, I'm not really sleeping, I'm in a trance, I'm meditating. You are not on watch. You are, for all other instances outside of those 4 hours, not able to cast spells. You are not able to, you are occupied by your rest, by your meditating trance. Let's address some dark vision stuff. Does all magical darkness block dark vision? This is a question that I've had for a long time. Magical darkness blocks dark vision only if the rules of the text for the particular instance of darkness say it does. For example, the darkness spell specifies that it produces a magical darkness that obstructs dark vision. That obstruction is a feature of the spell, not of magical darkness in general. So this is somewhere where I've messed up a decent amount. Anytime that magic created the darkness, I just assumed that dark vision was blocked. And that's not the case, only if the rule says that it obscures dark vision. So there are plenty of times when maybe it's forcibly dark in a place or a regional effect that makes the whole region dark, but dark vision would be just fine. Now on to some class features. Now, I think that the Artificer is pretty interesting, but I really just wanted to pick out this one new feature. Everything that's in this Sage Advice is going to be new for the Artificer because it's a new class. And the only thing that I really wanted to address is, can an Artificer dismiss one of their infusions on an object early? The answer is no. An infusion lasts until one of the circumstances described in infusing an item section of the infused item feature. This actually also translates to a lot of spells and magical items usage that I think a lot of people get wrong, including me sometimes, is that when you cast a spell, not every spell allows you to dismiss its effects just because you're the wielder of that magic. Not every transformation allows you to end that transformation. It's important to look at the rule for that specific spell or effect to see if you have the ability to change it afterwards or to dispel it. Sometimes you can't, and you just have to deal with the consequences of the spell until the duration is done. Down to Barbarian. For the Barbarian's reckless attack, do you grant advantage to all enemies or only the target of your attack? I play a half-orc Barbarian, and every time that I recklessly attack one person, every attack that round gets advantage on me. It's not the first attack by your enemy, it is every single attack. So you have to be able to use reckless attack sparingly. You're not going to want to use reckless attack surrounded by archers with one paladin in front of you. You're going to want to make sure that you have enough allies around you to draw some of that aggro so you're not taking 12 arrows at advantage. Down to Bard. Is the intent that a bard gets to know the number rolled on an attack roll or ability check before using cutting words, or should they always guess? If used on damage rolls, does cutting words apply to any kind of damage, including auto hits like magic missile? The second part of that is easier to answer than the first, and here they do say that literally any time the dungeon master needs to roll for damage, you can use cutting words to reduce it. Now, the first half of that question is harder to address, and I do think it's going to take a little bit of your DM's ruling here. The intent is that you would use cutting words in between when the dice is rolled and when you find out the result of the die roll. If the DM is going to tell you what the die roll is, which typically doesn't happen, then you would know whether it's going to succeed or fail ahead of time. So typically what happens is the DM will roll and they'll say, that's a hit. I would, to be safe, if you're a player, say you're going to use cutting words before they even roll the dice when you know who they're going to attack. Does using the College of Valor's combat inspiration add damage of an attack count as damage die for critical hits? Yes, that's dope. Don't forget that. If you're playing a bard, that's another die that you get to roll twice. Take advantage of it. I don't have anything for clerics. Here's an interesting question about the Moon Druid. Can a Circle of Moon Druid speak the languages it knows while in the form of an elemental? I really like this answer because they even address that a literal interpretation of the rules as written of Wild Shape could reasonably lead you to think that transformed druids can speak only languages that appear in the elemental stat block. That's how my party had been playing, and our druid would turn into a fire elemental, and we would just assume you need to speak infernal, and that we wouldn't understand what the druid was saying. But in actuality, the rule's intention is that the druid keeps their knowledge base, including the languages that they can speak, and can speak those languages in their transformed state. And on a similar note, if a druid in elemental form can speak, can the druid cast spells? The answer is no, because you get that feature in the Beast Spells feature at 18th level. And a general rule of thumb with all abilities or features, like can I wield a weapon in both hands and still add my proficiency bonus to both? Or can I hide behind this large person? If another class or race already gets that feature, the answer is going to be no unless you have it. One thing that the rules do is they don't only tell you what you can do, but what you can't do based on what other characters can. Let's move on to the fighter. If you use great weapon fighting with a feature like Divine Smite or a spell like Hex, do you get to reroll ones or twos on the rolls for your extra damage? I already know the answer to this one. The answer is no. If you're using great weapon fighting, which allows you to swing your great weapon, your two-handed weapon, and reroll ones and twos on the damage die one time, then that's just for your weapon damage. That's just for your great sword's damage. It's not for any cold damage that's added on. It's not for Divine Smite, or any other hex or ability on there. It's just your weapon damage. The last one for fighter we have is here, and it is, can the disarming attack maneuver disarm a creature of a shield that it has donned? And the answer is no. A shield is not merely held, it is donned, meaning it's got straps on it and things like that. The creature can only drop the item that it's holding, being an actual weapon. Next up is the monk, and I don't have a lot for the monk. To be honest, I'm not that interested in monks as a class, but the question is going to keep showing up later, and it's something that I think still needs addressed, and it's kind of frustrating in the game of Dungeons & Dragons, is, can a monk use Stunning Strike with an unarmed strike even though unarmed strikes aren't weapons? The answer is yes. Stunning Strike works with melee attacks. This is where it gets weird. An unarmed strike is a special type of melee weapon attack. The game often makes exceptions to the rules, and this is an important exception, that unarmed strikes count as melee weapon attacks despite not being weapons. Melee attacks are not weapons. Your hands are not weapons unless you're a monk in this specific instance, which is going to keep coming up, that melee, like unarmed strikes, are not weapons. But they make this weird exception here, and it does get confusing. And as a DM, it's hard to keep track of these things. So I agree with the ruling. Yes, Stunning Strikes work with unarmed strikes. It just makes sense as a monk. You could even just say that Stunning Strikes work with unarmed strikes. But this whole are unarmed strikes weapons or not gets really mixed up. And you'll actually see this in our next section here on Paladin. The question is, can Paladins use Divine Smite when they hit using unarmed strikes? And the answer is no, because Divine Smite requires melee attacks using a weapon. The rules don't consider unarmed strikes weapons. You see where this could get confusing? So I agree with the ruling. Yes, Stunning Strike, unarmed attacks. I don't really understand the explanation. We're going to skip Ranger and move on over to Rogue, because I didn't find any of the things in Ranger all that interesting. Can a rogue use sneak attack more than once per round? This is dope. I actually misunderstood this and thought that sneak attack was a once per round thing, but it's not. In the description here, it says that you're not limited once per round on sneak attack, you're limited once per turn. The opportunity for you to actually make sneak attacks on somebody else's turn are going to be fairly slim and mostly happen with opportunity attacks, or if somebody grants you the ability to attack with your reaction. So the only times when you can use sneak attack, basically, the only times when you're going to be using this sneak attack twice is when either A, you are given an attack with your reaction and have advantage on the opponent, maybe they're fairy fired or something, or if you're granted an attack outside of your turn with your reaction that somebody gives you and it still meets the requirements to have sneak attack. So in that case, yes, you can actually use sneak attack more than once per round, but probably no more than twice, as you only have one reaction. Does Uncanny Dodge work automatically against every attack a rogue or ranger gets hit by? Spell attacks too? Uncanny Dodge works against only one attack, because you only have one reaction to use on Uncanny Dodge. So if somebody fires multiple rays of an Eldritch Blast at you, you can use it to half the damage of the first one, but not the second. Also, it only works against attacks and targeted spell attacks, like a roll to hit kind of thing. When somebody uses a fireball or makes you use a saving throw to avoid damage, that's not what's happening. Like, Uncanny Dodge isn't going to help you at all. And my party has kind of house ruled that that's okay. So if somebody rolls a butt ton of damage on you with a fireball and you want to use Uncanny Dodge, go for it. Next, can a rogue use evasion if they are surprised? This one is kind of frustrating, and I think does take on a little bit more DM discretion, and I think Wizards of the Coast is still going to have to clarify some of their explanation here. It says, can a rogue use evasion if they are surprised? The rule states that if you are surprised, you can't move or take an action. A surprised rogue can use evasion, since that feature doesn't require the rogue to take an action or move. My question is twofold. One, they're saying that you're not required to take a move action, so you can still use evasion, meaning that thematically that's kind of weird, right? Like, you have to be able to dodge and physically move, but I guess just not outside of that 5-foot square. And then more problematic to me is what this is kind of implying, and I might be wrong, correct me if that's the case, but it seems like if you're surprised and you can't use actions or move, can you use bonus actions? Could you move a spiritual weapon into play if you're surprised? I'm not sure. Last is, does a thief's use of magic device allow them to use spell scrolls? The answer is yes. That's dope. On the sorcerer. If a sorcerer casts a spell with only verbal or somatic components using subtle spell, can an opponent use counterspell against it? If a spell is altered by subtle spell and has no material component, then it is impossible for anyone to perceive the spell being cast. So, since you can't see the casting, counterspell is of no use. That's dope. That's intense and probably will be abused, but it should be. That's sweet. I mean, if you have spells that take no material component and you're casting it subtly, why would anybody cast counterspell? I don't know why anybody would do that, so I agree. Does Quicken Spell allow a sorcerer to cast 2 spells around a first level or higher? The answer is no. The rule for casting spells is strict. There's very few ways that you can do this, and Quicken Spell is not one of them. You get it too early on, there's no way that that would be a possibility. Can my sorcerer use Twin Spell to affect a particular spell? Basically, the things to keep in mind are that you can't twin a spell that has the option of targeting more than one person. It doesn't matter if you're only targeting one person with all of the attacks. If it can target more than one person at that spell level, you can't be twinned. If the range is self, it can't be twinned. If you can target something that's other than a person or something, like an object or a door, it can't be twinned. Yeah, and if the spell causes more than one target to make a saving throw, it can't be twinned. On to Warlock. If a Warlock uses the Pact of the Blade to bond with a magical weapon, does that weapon have to be a melee weapon, and can the Warlock change the weapon's form? Now, you can create the weapon out of nothing, and whenever you do so, the determined weapon's form needs to be melee. It has to be a melee weapon. You can create a lot of weapons, like one at a time, but you wouldn't be able to form a ranged weapon. You can also use Pact of the Blade to bond with a magical item, and it has to be a magical item at that point. And then you could use it for a +1 longbow. Once you've formed a bond with that magical weapon, it's going to be the same magical weapon. You can't turn that longbow into a flame tongue longsword in this example, and you can't turn a dagger of venom into a maw or anything. It's going to always be the same weapon. On a wizard, how does Arcane Wizard interact with temporary hit points and damage resistance that an Abjure might have? An Arcane Wizard is not an extension of the wizard who creates it. It's a magical effect with its own hit points. Any temporary hit points, immunities, and resistance don't apply to the ward at all. The ward takes damage first. Any leftover damage is taken by the wizard and goes through the following game elements in this order: any relevant damage immunity, any relevant damage resistance, any temporary hit points, and then real hit points. So it's just a meat shield, basically. It's not going to have it's not a second version of yourself with all of the bumps and bonuses that you get. Does the 14th level illusionist ability let you make something real every round or just once? Illusory reality is intended to make one illusory object real per illusory spell. So, yeah, it's just going to be one per illusion spell. Last thing that we're going to look at is just whether or not the School of Divination wizard on the ethereal plane can use portent on a creature that the wizard can see in the material plane. And the answer is yes. Portent requires the ability to see the creature. It doesn't have a range restriction on that, which is dope. I could see people using a combination of spells to make this work to their advantage. Now, the last thing that I wanted to pull up was something that they didn't address here, and it's from a class feature that I think Jeremy really needs to address. The wording is terrible and leads to really confusing time at the table. And it's in the Druid Circle of Dreams. It's the Hearth of the Moonlight and Shadow. I'm just going to read through it so you guys can see the frustrating part of this. And it is pretty typical of how a lot of spells and abilities are written that are frustrating. So during a short or long rest, you can invoke the shadowy. During a short or long rest, you can invoke the shadowy power of the Glooming Court to help guard your respite. At the start of this rest, you touch a point in a space, and an invisible, keep this in mind, an invisible 30-foot radius sphere of magic appears. Already confusing as far as what's happening visually in the game if an invisible sphere appears. That doesn't quite make sense. Centered on that point, total cover blocks the sphere. We'll come back to that. Total cover blocks the sphere. Completely vague, very ambiguous. While within the sphere, you and your allies gain +5 to dexterity, stealth, and wisdom perception checks, and any light from open flame in the sphere, campfires, etc., aren't visible outside of it. The sphere vanishes at the end of the rest, or when you leave the sphere. What is happening here? Is it invisible and it's also obscuring? Is it that shadow and light are being used by nature to make like a strange exposure effect? What's happening here? And how does this invisible thing appear? That's not even that big of a deal. I could see how just by changing the verbiage to you summon an invisible sphere would resolve that issue. But the problem is there's no way to tell how this works, and because there's no way of telling what's actually happening, total cover blocks the sphere is confusing. My party thought that the sphere granted them total cover through the wilderness and the moonlight and all this stuff, that all those things were working in tandem to create total cover, including flames inside of their 30-foot radius campground. The other way that that can be read is that total cover obscures objects and creatures from the benefits given by the sphere. Like if anything the light touches from the center point gets the benefits, and anything in total cover from it does not, which is the way that I read it. Just something that I think should be cleared up, and yeah, it's kind of typical of what we're talking about here, and why I'm grateful that so many of these other spells are being taken care of. So, that's all I got for today. We will pick this up next week, and yeah, I'll see you then. Peace.